There are some fighters that you just see and you're like, yeah, this guy is different. Not just tough, not just skilled, but a guy who fights like he was born for war. One of those fighters was Mauricio Shogun Rua. Now this dude wasn't just about winning fights. He was about destroying souls. A storm of flying knees, head kicks, and some of the most violent soccer kicks and stomps ever seen in a ring. The kind of fighter who made fans jump out of their seats because when he stepped into the ring, you knew someone was getting hurt. In Pride, he was an unstoppable force, running through legends like they were warm-ups, leaving destruction in his wake. And yet, by the time he retired, he was barely a shadow of that legendary warrior. Gone were the brutal finishes, the relentless aggression. Instead, fans watched as a slower, battle-worn Shogun struggled to keep up with younger, fresher fighters. The same man who once made giants fall was now fighting just to survive. So, how did it all happen? How did a man who once ran through an entire generation of legends end up as just another veteran hanging on for too long? To understand that, we have to rewind the clock to see where it all started. Born in Curitiba, Brazil in 1981, Mauricio Rua was the younger brother of another fighter, Mario Ninja Rua. And if you've got an older brother who fights, you already know how the story goes. Shogun grew up getting his ass kicked by Ninja, but instead of backing down, he leaned into it. Fighting was in his blood, and in Curitiba, there was only one place you went to if you wanted to be a real killer: the Shootbox Academy. It was the kind of place that made men out of boys and killers out of men. Under the guidance of Rafael Cordeiro, Shogun sharpened his weapons: brutal knees, crushing leg kicks, and an aggressive Muay Thai meets wild brawler style that fit perfectly with Shootbox's philosophy. The gym had already built monsters like Vanderlei Silva, a dude whose nickname was literally the Axe Murderer. Now, when you train alongside men like that, you either become a savage or you get left behind. Shogun embraced the chaos. By the time he was 21, he was ready to unleash hell. And in 2003, he got his shot in the biggest, most violent MMA promotion on the planet, Pride Fighting Championships. Now, if you weren't watching MMA in the early 2000s, let me paint a picture for you. Pride FC was the closest thing we had to an actual gladiator arena. No small, controlled octagon with cushy sponsorship deals. No unified rules banning soccer kicks. Pride was where the wildest, most violent fighters went to make a name for themselves. And when Shogun arrived, he fit in like a wolf in a pack of killers. He debuted in 2002, and from the moment he stepped into the ring, people knew he was special. His first few fights were straight-up executions. He wrecked dudes like Akira Shoji and Yoshihito Namikawa, blasting through them like they were nothing. His striking was ruthless, his ground game was slick, and the aggression was terrifying. But the fight that really put the world on notice? Shogun versus Quentin Rampage Jackson in 2005. Now, Rampage was a monster back then. He wasn't the fun-loving, chain-wearing, trash-talking Rampage that you gotta see later on in the UFC. This dude was power-bombing people through the ring in Pride. He was strong, explosive, and damn near impossible to intimidate. And what did Shogun do? He absolutely murdered him. This fight is one of the most violent one-sided beatdowns in MMA history. Shogun came out like a man possessed, cracking Rampage with brutal punches and knees, and then literally breaking his ribs with a knee to the body. Rampage collapsed, and Shogun started stomping his head into the mat. It was brutal, it was savage, and it was peak Pride FC violence. With that win, Shogun wasn't just a rising prospect anymore. He was one of the scariest fighters on the planet, and the next few months would cement his legacy forever. Now, if you ask hardcore MMA fans what the greatest tournament run of all time was, you're gonna hear one name over and over again. Shogun Rua 2005 Pride Middleweight Grand Prix. This tournament had a who's who of killers, and somehow a 23-year-old Shogun ran through it like a wrecking ball. Let's break it all down. It started with Quentin Rampage Jackson. Rampage was a powerhouse, known for slamming opponents through the canvas. But against Shogun, he never got the chance. From the opening bell, Shogun overwhelmed him with relentless aggression, chopping him down with brutal leg kicks before finishing him with a savage combination of soccer kicks and knees. It was a statement win. Shogun wasn't just here to compete, he was here to take over. Next, he faced Antonio Rogerio Nogueira in what turned out to be one of the most insane brawls in MMA history. Lil Nog cracked Shogun with punches that would have put most fighters to sleep, but Shogun just kept coming forward. He mixed in takedowns, clinch work, and vicious ground and pound to secure a decision victory. This fight wasn't just a win, it proved that Shogun wasn't just a killer. He had an iron chin and an endless heart. Then came Alistair Overeem. Now at the time, Overeem was a dangerous, well-rounded striker. But against Shogun, he never had a chance. Shogun walked him down, stuffed his offense, and put him out cold in the first round. Another dominant finish, another step closer to history. And then the finals. Ricardo Arona, a fighter known for shutting down legends. But against Shogun, it was over before it even started. Shogun blitzed him early, landed heavy shots, and knocked him out cold. By the time he crushed Arona, there was no debate. Shogun Rua was the baddest man on the planet at 205 pounds. This was his peak. He was the future of MMA.
We were talking on the way here. Mauricio Shogun Rua, remember, 23 years old, goes through Quentin Rampage Jackson, Antonio Rogerio Nogueira, one of the best fights in Pride history, and then in one night, Alistair Overeem and Ricardo Arona to win that Grand Prix. And, you know, say what Jon Jones did at 23, God bless him, man, one of the best. But Mauricio Shogun Rua, a beast at that age, man.
Oh, yeah.
But MMA has a way of taking that future and then tearing it apart. And for Shogun, that is exactly what was about to happen. You see, after running through Pride's best in 2005 and establishing himself as the guy at 205, you would think that Shogun was set to dominate for years, right? Nope. Because if there's one thing MMA does not give a damn about, it's fairy tale endings. And for Shogun, that harsh reality came crashing down the moment he stepped into the UFC. Now, let's put this into context. By the time that Shogun made his UFC debut in 2007, Pride had been bought out. The UFC had taken over, and Pride legends were either going to sink or swim in the octagon. A lot of fans thought Shogun was going to run through the UFC's light heavyweight division the same way that he did in Pride. I mean, why wouldn't he? He was that dude. But there was one big problem. Shogun's body was already falling apart. The guy was only 25 years old, but his knees, they were like 60. Now people forget this, but before he even had his first fight in the UFC, he tore his ACL. He had surgery, but rushed back way too soon because he wanted to make a statement. And his first opponent was Forrest Griffin. Now at the time, nobody was giving Forrest a chance. Forrest was tough, sure, but this was Shogun Rua we are talking about. The guy who stomped out Rampage. The guy who had one of the most legendary tournament runs in MMA history. Forrest was just the dude from Tough who had a fun brawl with Stephan Bonner. Except this wasn't Pride. And this wasn't Pride Shogun. From the moment the fight started, you could tell that something was off. Shogun looked like himself. He had the same stance, the same aggression, but he just wasn't moving right. His usual explosive bursts were gone. His signature head movement was slower. His cardio completely shot. And Forrest took full advantage. For 3 rounds, Forrest Griffin put the pressure on him, stayed in his face, and used his size and cardio to break Shogun down. By the 3rd round, it was clear that this wasn't the same guy that we saw in Pride. Then came the final nail in the coffin. Forrest took Shogun down, got his back, and sunk in the rear naked choke. And just like that, in his UFC debut, Shogun Rua, the destroyer of Pride, was tapping out. Fans were stunned. This was supposed to be his coronation, his first step toward UFC gold. Instead, he had just lost to a guy that most people thought he was going to smoke. And to make matters worse, he tore his ACL again in that fight. That was the real story that night. It wasn't just about Shogun losing, it was about his body starting to betray him.
Doesn't say anything and he just shows up.
Right. Knee surgeries, bouncing back from these knee surgeries. I mean, when George St. Pierre had his knee surgery, everybody was talking about, will this be the, end of his career and all this stuff. This guy's had like 2 or 3 knee surgeries. His appendix were removed, and the list goes on and on. Shogun is a badass warrior, man, and he's nowhere near being done.
Now let's talk about ACL injuries real quick. If you are an explosive fighter, especially a guy like Shogun who relied on speed, movement, and power, an ACL tear is devastating. And Shogun didn't just tear it once. By the time his career was over, he had 4 separate ACL surgeries. Now think about that. 4 times this dude had to completely rebuild his knee, go through months of brutal rehab, and try to return to the elite level of MMA. That's the thing casual fans don't always realize. After each ACL tear, you lose something. Maybe it's a little bit of speed. Maybe it's endurance. Maybe it's confidence. For Shogun, it was all of the above. His once fluid movement became more labored. His ability to explode into strikes and cut angles diminished. That aggressive, unrelenting style that he was known for, it became harder to maintain. And worst of all, he couldn't trust his body the way that he used to. After the Forrest Griffin loss, he had to sit out for almost 2 years. 2 years in MMA is an eternity. And by the time he came back, the UFC landscape had completely changed. Pride was gone. The UFC's light heavyweight division was the most stacked it had ever been. And the UFC had a new king at 205. Some karate specialist named Lyoto Machida. But before Shogun could even think about a title shot, he had one goal: get revenge on Forrest Griffin. But first, there was this weird fight with Mark Coleman. Now, if you don't remember Mark Coleman, he was one of the original UFC champions, one of the first true wrestlers in MMA. But by 2009, Mark Coleman was done. He was 44 years old, barely making weight, and honestly had no business being in the cage with Shogun. And yet somehow, this fight turned into a sloppy mess. Shogun won, but it was ugly. He was still slow, still gassing out way too early, and fans weren't sure if he was ever going to be the same. It wasn't until his next fight, Shogun versus Chuck Liddell, that people saw a glimpse of the old Shogun again. And damn, what a knockout that was. By 2009, Chuck Liddell wasn't quite the same guy he was in his prime. His chin was gone, and he was on his way out. But the UFC still needed stars, and Chuck still had name value. So they threw him in there with Shogun, hoping for a banger. Well, they got one. For about 3 minutes. Chuck was doing well, landing clean shots, looking sharp, and then, boom! Shogun clipped him with a brutal left hook, and Chuck Liddell crumpled to the mat like a sack of bricks. It was vintage Shogun. And just like that, people started believing again. Maybe the injuries hadn't completely ruined him. Maybe he could still be a champion. And after that knockout, the UFC gave him the opportunity to do just that. Shogun's next fight would be a title shot against Lyoto Machida, one of the most hyped up champions in UFC history. Machida had this weird, elusive karate style that nobody could figure out. He was undefeated, and he had just destroyed Rashad Evans to win the belt. And Joe Rogan infamously was calling it the Machida era. Well, Shogun wasn't trying to hear any of that. When these two met in the cage, we got one of the most controversial title fights in UFC history. Instead of chasing Machida and getting countered like everyone else, Shogun systematically destroyed his legs and body. It was brutal. For 5 rounds, Shogun chopped him down with leg kicks, landed big body shots, and just made Machida look human for the first time ever. And when the final bell rang, everyone watching knew who won. Shogun had just pulled off one of the smartest, most well-executed performances ever. So imagine the reaction when the judges announced, winner by unanimous decision, Lyoto Machida. The MMA world exploded. Fans were pissed. Fighters were pissed. Even Dana White, who was hyping up Machida all year, was like, yeah, Shogun should have won that. This was one of those rare cases where nobody defended the decision. Machida's face busted up. His legs destroyed. His aura of invincibility gone. But instead of getting his moment, Shogun got screwed by the judges. Luckily, the UFC had no choice but to run it back. And this time, Shogun wasn't leaving it up to the judges. Shogun walked into that rematch like a man on a mission. No more cautious game plans, no more letting Machida dance around. This time, he was going to end him. And in the very first round, that is exactly what he did. Machida tried to play his usual elusive game, but Shogun timed him perfectly, landing a massive right hand that sent Machida crashing to the mat. And then Shogun jumped on him and hammered him with ground and pound until Machida was completely unconscious. The crowd went insane. After all the injuries, the setbacks, and that BS decision in the first fight, Shogun Rua was finally a UFC champion.
We'll prove tonight that the first time, maybe everybody was right with the scoring. To go out and knock out Lyoto Machida in the first round the way that he did, I mean, to say it's impressive is stupid. It's unbelievable. It's incredible. And when he first came over to the UFC, and I was talking about the ring rust, he had the back-to-back knee surgeries.
And for a moment, it felt like he had officially reclaimed his spot as the king of 205. But if you know how MMA works, you already know what happens next. Because in this sport, the good times never last long. Just as Shogun was getting ready for his first title defense, Rashad Evans pulled out with an injury. And instead of rescheduling, the UFC threw in this young, lanky kid from New York, a 23-year-old prospect named Jon Jones. Now at the time, people knew Jones was good, but nobody knew he was about to become the greatest light heavyweight of all time. And unfortunately for Shogun, he had to be the first victim of the Jon Jones era. Their fight was brutal. From the moment the bell rang, it was clear that this was a different kind of challenge.
Jon Jones, when he fought Mauricio Shogun Rua for the light heavyweight title when he was 23 years old, he opens up the fight with a flying knee. Nobody does that. You're fighting a legend. Shogun at that time was a legend.
Yeah.
And not just a legend from the UFC, but a legend from Pride.
Yeah.
Pride was this gigantic organization in Japan that Shogun really became famous.
Yeah.
So he was a mythical creature almost in MMA circles. That was Shogun Rua.
Jones was bigger, stronger, and faster. And perhaps more importantly, he had zero respect for Shogun's legacy. In the very first round, Jones came out with a flying knee that immediately put Shogun on his heels. From that moment on, it was a one-sided beatdown. Jones took him down at will, smashed him with elbows, controlled the clinch, made him look helpless. And by the third round, Shogun wasn't just losing, he looked completely broken. Jones landed a devastating body shot, followed up with more strikes, and Shogun literally collapsed against the cage. That was it. The ref stopped the fight, and Jon Jones was the new UFC light heavyweight champion. And Shogun never really recovered. This was the moment when fans realized Shogun's body was done. He was only 29 years old, but with all the wars, all the surgeries, and all the damage, his body was already past its expiration date. The aura of invincibility was gone. Before this fight, even in his losses, Shogun always felt dangerous, always felt like he had one more war left in him. But after Jones, that mystique was shattered. And what followed wasn't just a decline, it was a slow, painful unraveling. From here on out, we entered the final phase of his career, where every fight felt like we were just watching him trying to hang on. Sometimes he'd show flashes of his old self, like his rematch with Forrest Griffin, where he got revenge with a first-round KO. Other times, it was hard to watch, like when Dan Henderson put him through hell in one of the most brutal fights in MMA history. Either way, one thing was clear: Shogun Rua's prime was officially over. But here's the thing about legends like Shogun Rua: they don't quit easily. So instead of calling it a career, he just kept fighting even when it was clear that his body wasn't up for it anymore. If you look at Shogun's record after winning the UFC title in 2010, it's like watching a stock market crash in slow motion. One of those brutal declines where investors keep hoping for a rebound, but the numbers just keep dipping lower. One fight he looks great, the next he looks done. One step forward, two steps back. In 2011, he knocks out Forrest Griffin. Boom! But then later that year, he gets destroyed by Dan Henderson in a 5-round war. In 2012, he rebounds with a nasty KO of Brandon Vera. Next fight, he gets choked out cold by Chael Sonnen in the first round. It was the same pattern every time. A little glimpse of the old Shogun, followed by a brutal reminder that this wasn't Pride anymore. The real problem was that his style never changed. Even after all the surgeries, even after all the injuries, he still fought like he was 25 years old. Dude would go into these fights with guys 10 to 15 years younger than him and just swing for the fences. No footwork adjustments, no defensive improvements, just pure shoot-box aggression, even when his body was screaming at him to stop. And look, we can't talk about Shogun's decline without mentioning one of the most savage beatings he ever took. March 23, 2014, Shogun versus Dan Henderson 2. Now, if you remember their first fight back in 2011, you know it was an all-time classic. But the rematch? Man, that was just sad to watch. Shogun came out firing, and for the first 2 rounds, it actually looked like he was gonna get his revenge. Hendo was old and slow, and Shogun was lighting him up. Then out of nowhere, boom! Dan Henderson landed his H-bomb, one of the hardest punches in MMA history. And just like that, Shogun crumpled. It was like watching a lion that had fought one battle too many. And the worst part, his nose was literally smashed into his face. Seriously, if you look at the pictures from that fight, Shogun's nose looked like it was trying to escape from his skull. After that loss, it became painfully obvious. Shogun just wasn't built for this anymore. By the late 2010s, the guy had no knees left. His chin, once one of the toughest in the sport, was fading fast. And worst of all, he was still fighting killers, because the UFC doesn't do farewell tours. You don't get easy fights just because you're a legend. If you stick around too long, they throw you to the wolves. And the wolves were hungry. In 2014, OSP knocked him out in the first round. In 2018, Anthony Smith knocked him out in less than 90 seconds with nasty elbows. And in 2020, Paul Craig smashed him on the ground until the ref had to step in. Every fight was the same story. Shogun wouldn't quit, but his body couldn't keep up. Now, I gotta give credit where it's due. There were moments when we saw glimpses of the old Pride Shogun, like when he fought Tyson Pedro in 2018. Pedro was younger, faster, and way more athletic, but Shogun refused to go away. He took Pedro's best shots, weathered the storm, and then knocked him out in the 3rd round. For a brief moment, it felt like we were back in 2005. But here's the thing about aging fighters. Those moments get rarer and rarer, and eventually they stop happening altogether. By 2020, even the most die-hard Shogun fans knew it was time. The man had given us everything, and he just couldn't take the damage anymore. His last few fights weren't just losses, they were painful to watch. So finally in 2023 at UFC 283, he had his last fight against Ihor Potieria, a guy who wasn't even ranked. Shogun got finished in the first round. And just like that, one of the greatest careers in MMA history came to an end. No fairy tale ending, no final win, just the brutal reality of combat sports. The sport moves on, and legends don't get to choose how they leave. Shogun retired with a final record of 27 wins, 14 losses, and 1 draw. Not the prettiest record, but don't let it fool you, because every scar on that record tells the story of a man who fought the absolute best of his era. Pride killers, UFC champions, and the new generation of hungry contenders. So now that the war is over, the dust has settled, the question remains. Where does he stand among the all-time greats? Well, that's the million-dollar question, right? Because if you ask hardcore fans, they'll tell you that Shogun Rua is one of the most legendary light heavyweights to ever do it. But if you ask a casual fan, someone who maybe only started watching after 2015, they might just see a guy who lost a lot in the UFC and never fully lived up to expectations. And honestly, that's what makes Shogun's career so damn interesting. When you are ranking all-time greats, the biggest thing you look at is their peak, the absolute best version of them. And let's be real here, Pride-era Shogun was an absolute monster. At his best, he wasn't just winning fights, he was wrecking dudes in a way that made people think he was unbeatable. Think about it. He came into Pride as a 22-year-old wild man and ran through a murderer's row of killers. Rampage, Lil Nog, Overeem, Arona, 4 finishes, 1 Grand Prix title, and he did all of that in 1 year. Who else has done that? Maybe Jon Jones, maybe DC, maybe prime Chuck Liddell, maybe even Yuri Prohashka in terms of sheer wildness, unpredictability, and that never back down style. But even those guys didn't have the kind of blistering, relentless video game assault style that Shogun brought to the table. And if you're just talking about the most dangerous light heavyweights ever, Prime Shogun is right at the top. He's where the real debate starts getting interesting. What if Shogun never blew out his knees? What if his body didn't break down so early? Because let's be honest, Shogun never got to be 100% in the UFC. By the time he arrived, his knees were already shredded. And when your entire fighting style is based on explosiveness, crazy kicks, and violent scrambles, losing your knees is like a guitarist losing his fingers. We never really got to see what a fully healthy Shogun could have done in the UFC. Would he have held on to the title a little longer? Would he have beaten Jon Jones? Would he have had a Chuck Liddell type run at the top? We'll never know. But here's the thing, even with all the injuries, all the wars, all the surgeries, Shogun still managed to win a UFC title and put on some of the best fights in the sport's history. So imagine how much more insane his career would have been if his body actually held up. But legacy isn't just about who you beat and the championships you've won. It's about how you changed the game. And Shogun absolutely changed MMA. His style, this crazy, aggressive Muay Thai BJJ hybrid, became a blueprint for so many fighters after him. Think about guys like Charles Oliveira or Thiago Santos. They fight with that same killer instinct, that mentality of, I don't care if I take damage as long as I hurt you more. And that all comes from shootbox. Shogun, Vanderlei, Anderson Silva, those guys paved the way for the next generation of violent, technical strikers in MMA. Even guys like Alex Pereira, you can see shades of Shogun in how they move forward, absorb damage, and keep coming. And if you look at someone like Yuri Prohashka, it's almost like seeing a modern-day, bigger, and slightly crazier version of Shogun. So even if Shogun never had a long reign as UFC champion, he still left his mark on the sport.